Nora had always been drawn to small, remote places, the kind of towns that didn't appear on most maps, where the streets seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowed by the silence of the surrounding wilderness. It was a place that time forgot, where the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was more unsettling than peaceful. This particular town, however, seemed different in a way that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Nestled between towering forests and rolling hills, it seemed almost like a shadow, a forgotten corner of the world where everything was suspended in a kind of eerie calm. The town's name was Ridgefield, but it didn't feel like a place. It felt more like a memory, a half-forgotten dream. Nora had moved here to escape. Her life in the city had become a blur of noise, faces, and endless expectations. Every corner seemed filled with some new pressure, some new responsibility, and her mind had become a constant battleground of thoughts and worries. So, when she saw the ad for a small cottage in Ridgefield, the idea of solitude seemed like a sweet escape. She packed her things and left without a second thought. The cottage was quaint, perched on the edge of the town, with a small overgrown garden and a view of the dense forest that bordered the town like a wall. The air was fresher, the nights quieter, and the days were a slow, gentle march toward nothingness. But something about Ridgefield didn't sit right with her. It wasn't the people, who were friendly, albeit a little too reserved for her liking. It was the town itself. The way it stood still in time, the way the trees seemed to press in on all sides, as if the world outside had simply forgotten it existed. The first thing she noticed was the sound, or rather, the lack of it. The quiet was oppressive, almost unnatural. In the city there was always something, the hum of traffic, the distant murmur of voices, the rush of air. But here, there was nothing. The silence felt thick, like a blanket smothering the town, and no matter how hard she tried to embrace it, Nora couldn't shake the sense of unease. It wasn't long before she began to hear the whispers. At first, they were faint, almost like the wind rustling through the trees. She tried to ignore them, chalking them up to her overactive imagination, but the sound seemed to follow her. Late at night, when the world outside her cottage had settled into an eerie calm, she would hear it, soft, indistinct murmurs, like voices just beyond her reach. Sometimes they sounded like conversations, other times like chanting. Always, they were faint, like distant echoes bouncing off the walls of her mind. Nora would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself it was just the wind, just the house settling. But each time, the whispers seemed to get closer, louder, as though something, or someone, was watching her from the shadows. And each time she closed her eyes, the voices would grow clearer, more distinct. One evening, after a long tiring day of unpacking and exploring the area, Nora decided to take a walk through the town. She had explored the cottage and its surroundings but hadn't ventured into Ridgefield itself yet. She passed the small shops, old brick buildings with faded signs, and the empty streets where the only movement was the occasional stray cat darting between alleyways. The town felt still, almost unnervingly so. It was as though the buildings themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. She walked down the main street, where a few weathered houses stood, their windows dark and unwelcoming. As she approached the town square, she saw an old man sitting on a bench, staring ahead with a vacant expression. His clothes were tattered and his eyes seemed glazed over, as if he were lost in a distant memory. He didn't acknowledge her presence as she passed by, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow aware of her. watching her every move from the corner of his eye. His gaze felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on her chest. Nora quickened her pace, eager to get back to the comfort of her cottage. But as she turned a corner, she froze. A figure stood in front of her, just ahead on the path. A woman, tall and thin, with long flowing hair that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. She was dressed in a long dark dress that trailed behind her like a shadow, and her face was obscured by the veil of her hair. The woman didn't move or speak. She simply stood there, as if waiting for Nora to approach. For a moment, Nora felt paralyzed. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her feet refused to obey. Something about the woman's presence was both familiar and alien, as if she had been waiting for Nora all her life. The air around her grew colder, and Nora shivered despite herself. Slowly, the woman raised her hand, her fingers outstretched, and for an instant, Nora thought she saw something. Something in the woman's palm. A symbol. A swirling pattern, intricate and alive, as though it were moving. Then, without warning, the woman disappeared, dissolving into the twilight as if she had never been there at all. Nora stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She turned and ran back to her cottage, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she reached the door, she froze once again. There, lying on the doorstep, was a small piece of paper, folded neatly in half. With trembling hands, she unfolded it, reading the message scrawled inside. "You should have left while you still could." The handwriting was strange, jagged, as if written in haste, but it was the symbol at the bottom that caught her eye, the same swirling design she had seen in the woman's hand. She felt a chill run down her spine as the night air seemed to grow even colder. Nora stepped back, her mind racing. What did it mean? Who had left this note? And why? She looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty. No one was watching. No one was there. But the whispers were still there. If you're intrigued, like and share this story with your friends. Let's see if they can handle what's next. The night was suffocating in its stillness. As Nora sat at her cottage, the note still gripped tightly in her hand, she could feel the oppressive weight of it, as though the words had burned themselves into her mind. She had read the cryptic message over and over, each time trying to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to fit. You should have left while you still could. Who had written it, and why? What did it mean? And more importantly, why was she so compelled to stay in Ridgefield despite everything? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled deeper into something she had no control over. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, a soft, distant thump, like something heavy falling to the ground. Nora's body tensed. She stood up quickly, her breath shallow, and walked toward the window. Her eyes scanned the darkness outside. Nothing. The garden lay still, the trees swaying gently in the wind, and the faint outline of the forest loomed just beyond the reach of the cottage's porch light. But it wasn't the trees or the wind that unsettled her. It was the feeling, the deep, gnawing sensation in her gut that something was moving in the shadows, something watching her. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just her imagination, but her instincts told her otherwise. She wasn't alone. Nora spent the next few hours pacing the rooms of the cottage, trying to distract herself from the growing sense of unease. Her mind kept returning to the mysterious woman in the streets of Ridgefield. The veil of hair, the symbol, everything about her had felt unreal, like a dream, or perhaps a warning. She couldn't explain it, but the encounter had felt too real to be ignored. But there was more. The note, the strange symbol. All of it was connected, and she needed to understand why. Unable to sleep, she decided to walk into town the following morning. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find, but something urged her to speak with someone. Someone who might know more about Ridgefield, about its history, about the woman. She had heard whispers of an old librarian, a woman named Miss Harrow, who was said to know the true history of the town. Some of the locals spoke about her with an air of reverence, others with caution, as though she were a figure of mystery or even fear. Nora found the small library nestled between two ancient oak trees, its stone exterior weathered by time, but it was the musty, ancient smell of the place that hit her first. The scent of old books, of history preserved in faded pages, was strangely comforting. Inside, the shelves stretched high, filled with volumes that seemed to have been untouched for decades. There was an eerie quietness here too, but this time it felt different, more welcoming than oppressive. Miss Harrow was nowhere to be seen, but Nora could feel the presence of the woman in the air. She wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of the books. The place felt old, ancient even. As Nora reached the back of the library, a soft cough broke the silence, and she turned to see a thin, elderly woman standing in the doorway, her frail frame barely visible beneath a heavy shawl. "You must be new to Ridgefield," the woman said, her voice surprisingly clear, though it carried a sense of something ancient in it, something older than time itself. "What brings you to this forgotten place, child?" Nora hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to begin. I've been hearing strange things," she said, her voice uncertain. "Whispers, late at night. I found this note on my doorstep." She handed the piece of paper to Miss Harrow, who examined it carefully, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the symbol. "This is no ordinary town," Miss Harrow said softly, almost to herself. "You've come at a time when the veil between our world and theirs grows thin. The whispers you hear, those voices are not from this world. They are from the others, the ones who live just beyond the edges of the reality we know." Nora's breath caught in her throat. She had expected the librarian to dismiss her concerns, to tell her that it was all in her head. But Miss Harrow's words carried a weight of truth that Nora couldn't ignore. "Who are they?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Harrow stepped closer, her eyes dark and full of secrets. "They are ancient spirits, remnants of something older than this town. The town itself is built on a land where the boundaries between worlds are thinner than anywhere else. The whispers are their calls, calls to those who are drawn to them. And you, Nora, you have been chosen." Nora felt her pulse quicken. Chosen? Chosen for what? "For what happens next," Miss Harrow said, her voice grave. "There are things in this town that should never be seen, never be heard, and the closer you get to them, the more they will pull you in. You need to leave, child, before it's too late." Nora stood frozen, her mind racing. The woman's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, settling deep in her chest. But despite everything, there was a part of her, a part she couldn't explain, that felt a strange sense of curiosity, an unshakable need to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. As Nora turned to leave, Miss Harrow grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong for such a frail woman. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "The people here, They know more than they let on. They may smile at you, but they are hiding something. Watch your step, and do not trust anyone fully, not even yourself." With that, she released Nora's arm, and the air seemed to grow colder. Nora felt a shiver run down her spine, but as she left the library, a new resolve settled in her chest. She wasn't ready to leave Ridgefield, not yet. That night, the whispers grew louder. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't even think clearly. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were thoughts, invading her mind, filling her with a sense of dread that made her heart race. But there was something else, something deep in her chest that called her forward, urged her to listen more closely, to understand what they wanted. Nora stood at her window again, staring into the darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the quiet town. For the first time since she arrived, she felt as if she wasn't alone, not in the sense of being watched, but in a much deeper way. The town itself seemed to breathe, to pulse with an energy that she couldn't describe. And then, as if responding to her thoughts, a figure appeared in the distance. It was a woman, just like before, standing in the street, motionless, watching her. The same dark dress, the same veil of hair, the same eerie stillness. The figure raised its hand again, the symbol in its palm glowing faintly in the moonlight. Nora's heart pounded in her chest. She had to know more. She had to understand. With a breath caught in her throat, she stepped outside, into the night. Does this story feel like it's just getting started? Drop a comment below and tell me what you think will happen next. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Nora walked cautiously toward the woman, who stood motionless in the street, her dark figure barely visible under the dim light of the street lamp. The whispers, which had once been distant, now felt so close they seemed to breathe with her. They were no longer just sounds. They were voices, layered over one another, murmuring phrases in languages she couldn't understand. But they were all saying the same thing. Come closer. The wind picked up, swirling around Nora, as though urging her forward. Despite the fear gnawing at her chest, there was a strange pull, an undeniable force that seemed to beckon her toward the woman. She couldn't explain it, but she had to go. There was no choice. Each step she took toward the figure in the street felt like a step further into something unknown, something from which there was no return. Her mind raced with questions, but the closer she got, the more everything seemed to blur. Her thoughts felt muffled, as though the world around her was becoming a fog, thickening and closing in. As she neared the figure, she saw the woman's hand raised once more, the strange symbol etched into her palm. It glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat, and for a moment, Nora thought she saw something in the woman's eyes, a glint of recognition, as if the woman knew her better than anyone, as though they had met before. The woman's lips parted, and a voice like the rustling of leaves whispered into Nora's mind. "You should have left, Nora. You should have listened to the warning." Nora froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice, soft, ethereal, yet filled with an ancient sadness, felt like a memory rather than a present reality. The words didn't just reach her ears, they reached into her very soul, stirring something deep within her, something that had been dormant since she first arrived in Ridgefield. "But it's too late now," the voice continued, its tone shifting, becoming more urgent, more desperate. You've already crossed the threshold. There is no turning back." Nora wanted to run, but her body refused to obey. It was as if her feet were rooted to the ground, unable to move, trapped in a web of unspoken truths. Her eyes locked onto the glowing symbol, and she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, as though something was awakening inside of her, something she couldn't name. "Who are you?" Nora's voice trembled as she spoke, the words barely escaping her lips. "What do you want from me?" The woman tilted her head, her long hair swaying gently in the wind. "I am what remains," she said, her voice barely audible now, almost lost in the wind. "I am what the town has forgotten, what the forest hides, and I have been waiting for you." Nora's mind raced, her heart pounding in her ears. Waiting for me? But how? She had never seen this woman before, and yet there was something disturbingly familiar about her. The sensation of déjà vu washed over her, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw a reflection of herself in the woman's eyes. Before Nora could speak again, the woman raised her hand, the symbol glowing brighter now, almost blindingly so. The air around them seemed to ripple, as though reality itself was warping and twisting. And then, with a sudden motion, the woman stepped aside, revealing what lay beyond her. It wasn't the street that stretched before Nora. It wasn't even the town. What lay beyond her was a dark, swirling void, an endless abyss that seemed to reach out to her, pulling her in. The trees that lined the path had disappeared, replaced by an oppressive, unnatural silence. The whispers were now gone, replaced by a suffocating stillness that clung to the very air. "Step forward," the woman whispered, her voice soft but insistent. "Step into the truth." Nora stood at the edge of the abyss, her body trembling. Every instinct told her to turn away, to run back to the cottage, to escape the cold grip of whatever this place was. But there was something else, a pull stronger than fear, stronger than reason, that urged her to move forward. With a shaky breath, Nora took a step. The moment her foot touched the ground, the world around her shifted. The ground beneath her seemed to melt away, the air warping in strange, impossible ways. She felt herself falling, tumbling through space, yet she wasn't afraid. There was no pain, no sense of danger, just the sensation of being swept away, like a leaf in a current. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in Ridgefield. The place she found herself in was beyond description. It wasn't a place at all, really. It was a realm suspended between worlds, a place where time didn't exist and reality itself seemed to bend. The sky above her was a swirling mass of colors that defied the natural world. Purples, greens, and blacks meshed together in a dance of light and shadow, shifting and changing with each passing moment. The ground beneath her feet was soft, like moss, but when she looked down, she saw that it wasn't solid at all. It seemed to move, shifting and pulsing like a living thing. She tried to move forward, but every step felt like it took her deeper into the unknown. The air was thick with the scent of something ancient, something forgotten, and the whispers returned, louder than ever before. This time, however, the whispers were not words. They were feelings. Emotions, raw and overwhelming, fear, longing, despair, joy, and beneath them all an undeniable sense of power, of something vast and all-encompassing that existed just out of reach. Nora felt herself drawn to it, like a moth to a flame, unable to resist the allure of what lay ahead. She turned her head, and for the first time she saw them, the other figures, the ones who had been whispering to her all along. They were shadows, indistinct and fleeting, their forms shifting in and out of view. They moved with an eerie grace, their eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light, but there was no malice in them, at least not in the way she understood it. They were not human, not in the sense she was familiar with. They were something else, something that existed beyond the boundaries of the world she knew. "You are here," one of them said, its voice like a soft breeze, "at the crossroads of fate." Nora opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She felt a sudden weight in her chest, as if something was pressing down on her heart. The figures gathered around her, their faces obscured, yet she felt no fear. In fact, she felt more alive than she ever had before, like she was standing on the precipice of something monumental, something that would change everything. The woman who had led her here stepped forward from the shadows, her figure now clearer than ever before. Her eyes locked onto Nora's, and for the first time, Nora saw them, the truth in those eyes. There was no malice there, no trickery, only a deep, profound sadness, as though the woman had seen everything and had accepted that some things were beyond comprehension. "You are the key," the woman said softly, her voice carrying a weight of inevitability. "You are the one who will decide what happens next." Nora felt her chest tighten, her mind reeling. The weight of those words crashed down on her, and she realized with a sudden clarity that everything had led to this moment. The whispers, the symbols, the strange woman. It was all part of a much larger tapestry, a story that was older than she could comprehend, a story that involved her more than she could ever have imagined. "Will you stay?" the woman asked, her voice barely audible in the vastness of the space. "Will you embrace the truth, no matter the cost?" Nora looked around at the shadows, at the swirling mass of colors, at the strange alien figures who watched her silently. For the first time, she felt truly, undeniably small, like a speck in the vast expanse of the universe. But there was a part of her that understood. The question wasn't whether she could stay, it was whether she would leave. She closed her eyes, her heart pounding, and made her choice. Are you ready to discover what happens next? Hit subscribe and ring the bell to stay tuned for the next chilling chapter of Nightmare Narratives. The story is far from over. There's still so much to uncover.